Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Bente, for the introduction. I want to start by wishing you all a very warm welcome to Oslo, and to share with you that the reason that we have invited you and that we are convening this event is because we are concerned and because we care about developments in Europe and beyond, as the title says. It's a global phenomenon, but today's main emphasis will be on trends in Europe. And that's important both because many of us are Europeans and care about our own continent, but also because I think it's fair to say that the European continent and the history of Europe entails both some of the best and some of the worst memories of humankind, in the sense that we have both seen the birth of liberalism, inclusiveness, tolerance, but also fascism, Nazism, and the extreme exclusivist ideologies. Both are contained in our historic European memory. And if Europe, again, would go in the wrong direction, that would not only affect the continent itself, but global developments. Hence, what's happening in this continent should be relevant for Europeans and not non-Europeans alike. And we're living in times of quite conflicting tendencies. On the one hand, we have seen remarkable progress towards more democracy in more countries. We have the whole democratization process of Eastern Europe. What we saw from the 80s in Latin America, we see big debates now in Asia about both relations between states, but also relations between state and their citizens. We see emerging democracies. We see an African continent with all its problems, which also contains 33 countries that has had more than one election, which has never ever been seen before. So we have positive trends and we have negative trends. And one of these negative trends is the increasing phenomenon of exclusivist ideology, of returning to the logic of us against them, of outright racism, and of other tendencies that we associate with some of the more darkest chapters of our own collective memory, our own history. And it's frequently referred to in Europe as a phenomenon that has been underpinned by economic crisis, a financial crisis that turned into a crisis in the real economy, a crisis in the real economy which led to mass unemployment, social insecurity, and decreasing trust between citizens and governments. And it's fair and correct, I think, to say that that background, that climate is fertile ground for some of the trends and tendencies that we will be speaking about at this conference. But it's also extremely important to insist on the fact that on the insight, on the value insight, that people are free to choose what they think. And people are free to make up their own mind. And they are not just products of their social setting. And that in the exclusivist ideology is exactly an ideology that some people choose to take on, and some people choose to use as a tool of political manipulation. And there are phenomena that we recognize. I spent a lot of time working on the conflicts in the Balkans. And I learned through that many visits and to academic research on how Yugoslavia collapsed and later political engagement with all the countries in the Western Balkans, that advanced societies where people were not only living together side by side, but even where they were proud of the fact that they were multicultural, where multiculturalism was part of identity, can within years, even months or weeks, change into a completely opposite climate where difference is made into a big phenomenon. And if that could happen there, as it could in the 1930s, there is no guarantee that it cannot happen again. Let me say that whenever we make the reference to the 1930s, we have to start by saying that we're not suggesting the 1930s as we knew them will come back. Of course, they will not in the same way. It's not that fascism, Nazism will be reborn as it existed, but that we have lessons learned about how societies can either move in a more liberal and tolerant direction or in a more exclusivist direction, and that can happen to everyone. We know it from this country. There were a lot of people flirting, advanced people with education, who were flirting with racist and Nazi ideology in the 1930s, more than we typically like to admit, because in 1945 everybody declared that they had been fighting against occupation, which of course was only partly true. So we have it in ourselves, and I think while the experience of the 1930s in Europe or the 1990s in the Western Balkans was very much about me against you, or us against them, or they against us, what the modern European construct is very much about, and I believe, since I very much believe in it, still will be about, is the other of modern integrated Europe is not another person or another group, but it's our own history. The other is the wrong way of doing it, hence we have to do it right. So we have redefined the concept of the other into our own evil, the potential for evil in ourselves, which is very different from what it used to be. And what are the symptoms? This us against them thinking. And them can be anyone. You know, them, the others, could be Jews, could be Roma, very contemporary phenomenon even in this country. It could be Muslims, it could be homosexuals or transsexuals, it could be anyone who's different. The purpose is not so much, it's not very much the character of the other, it's the phenomenon of defining me as something else as the other and making that into a radical difference, a significant and radical difference that trumps any kind of similarity that we would have. And these processes are the processes that we have to follow and understand. It's Carl Schmitt, who was one of the theoretical underpinnings. I mean, he was originally probably not Nazi, but he ended up as a kind of a theoretical underpinning of some of the ideology of the 1930s. He was making the point that the leader has to distinguish between friend and enemy, Freund und Feind. And he even said that he couldn't care less about who Feind was, who the enemy was. It was just that we have to make clear the leader had to organize logic on defining that somebody was the enemy, the opposite, the other, in order to gain political support. And this is a phenomenon that goes way beyond that particular political outlet. It's also a tendency of dehumanization, and this is something that I learned quite a lot about when I was working with the collapse of former Yugoslavia, is that people, it was almost a necessary step on the road to doing terrible things to other human beings, is that you redefine them as being something else than normal human beings. That you would say, I wouldn't have done this to a human being, but these people aren't any longer human beings. They were or they were not, but anyway, today they are not behaving as human beings, and you would sort of paint the non-human characters that you could find in the other. And also the logic of preemption, which is that I know that what I'm doing is quite terrible, but I have to do it now because the others are just about to do the same to us. Which is also very much what Anders Behring Breivik wrote, that, you know, that he knew that his massacres were terrible, but if he didn't do it in time, the others will do something similar to us. It's a very familiar logic argument that, you know, which in a sense explains to even to reasonably intelligent people why you do things that you would not do, because you transcend the logic of normal togetherness. And also the importance of the definition of the in-group, which is, you know, how do I make sure that everybody sees that I am clearly one of us? And a phenomenon that we've seen in many places, in many conflicts, is that sometimes people who are actually not very clear either this or that tends to end up as leaders of one of the in-groups, because they are in a sense cleansing cleansing themselves by attacking somebody else. I mean, that could be just to stick to the reason I used the Yugoslavia example is just as an illustration. It could be anywhere else in the world, but it could be a child of a Croat-Serb marriage who then wants to identify with either group and hence ends up killing the other group even more than others, because he often it's a he, but not always, wants to distinguish even more clearly make clear to his in-group that is really with them. We have also seen a lot of Basque terrorists who were clearly not from the Basque country, but who wanted to, you know, to demonstrate how Basque they had become even if their name was typically un-Spanish and un-Basque, and that they came from somewhere else in Spain. And there are many other examples of this, how you define yourself into the group. And these patterns are quite familiar. And I think many of the people doing research on this will recognize elements of that, and they can come in different orders and different shapes, but there are some recognizable features in this. What happened in Norway on the 22nd of July 2011 is a strong illustration that no country is immune. And I remember that there were so many, first I should say that I was affected by this. My son was on the island, one of the survivors from Utøya, almost killed. But in my more public role, one of my jobs was to receive many of the declarations of sympathy from the world, which by the way, were enormously important for us, and not the least those who were most affected. But what was quite interesting, a remarkable number of the declarations of sympathy with Norway said that, it could be like from Somalia, for instance, where people would say, these things happen in our country, but we were living the dream that there were some places where these things did not happen. So in a sense, we think it's even worse that is happening in Norway than at home, because that means that there is this ideal image of somebody who's been able to get away from all this is not true. That's an interesting comment, I think, and actually a quite relevant comment. And it also, of course, demonstrates that there is no automaticity between a kind of social, by economic social exclusion and becoming a perpetrator, because that can clearly not be recognized in the specific patterns of that terrorist crime. We focus today on right-wing extremism. And when we do that, it's not because we don't see other trends. There are many extremists out there. Almost any kind of idea can lead to an extremist excess. But there is something particular about that extremism which is presented on behalf of the majority against the minority. I think that's systematically different. You can have animal rights extremists who throw bombs because of people selling fur coats and so on. And you have, of course, a serious problem with jihadism. And there are many other sort of minority group excesses, extremism. But today, it's very much the focus on that particular type of extremism, whose internal logic is about, the majority against those who are unclean, outside those who are different. And these are trends that we've seen it in this country. We have seen the Jobbik party marching against the Jewish National Congress in Budapest. We're seeing the criminal case against the National Socialist Underground, NSU, in Germany. And there are too many examples of what's going on and that these things are happening. We believe that intolerance is a product of ignorance. We think that it's possible to create an antidote through dialogue, through education, through contact, exposure. We strongly believe that it's important to speak about these things. I think one of the main problems in today's Europe is not even close to saying that these extremist tendencies are in any kind of majority following. The problem is that the majority is silent and quiet about this, probably either strategically in order, that let's not talk about it because it may go too big, or by it's uncomfortable, I don't want to enter into that, let's just hope it goes over by itself. But we believe that we have to have a quite different response. We have to get it out in the open and speak about it. One of the dilemmas that I want to be very frank about, and which I think is a very difficult dilemma, where if anybody says they have a simple answer, I will question, whether they have thought enough about it. And that's the dilemma in how we delineate between our very strong insistence on freedom of speech, which I very much believe in. I think freedom of speech is utterly important in modern pluralist societies, on the one hand, and how we make sure that there is a limit to the freedom of speech when it comes into incitement to hatred and murder and attacks on minority groups. And I'm sure there's a balance that has to be struck. We have freedom of speech in this country, but we also have laws prohibiting outright racism. How do we make the right balance? And how do we make sure that these distinctions are made in the right way and not as excuses for prohibiting other things that should be out in the open? I really hope that this conference also can discuss that, because we as policy makers really need good advice on how we strike the right balances. And I think also it's important to say that while I do think there should be legal instruments, I also think that the primary response to expressions of hate and dehumanization and outright racism should be to speak up, should be counter-arguments, to engage in the debate. And I think here the blog sphere or the internet sphere has been, I think, what many people who, as I think all of us look upon ourselves as modern, liberal, educated people, have said, well, I mean, these strange expressions, they're not in the papers, they're not on the daily news, they're just on the internet. But the problem, of course, the challenge and the opportunity in the internet is that, there were certain opinions were so strange that in a small village, when you can only talk to the people you actually knew, there weren't enough people to form a club. But of course, if you have the world as the universe, I mean, there's no idea which is weird enough that you won't find 100 people out of 7 billion who agrees with you. So of course, there is a unique opportunity to ally in new forms. And we have to take that seriously, not by closing down, but by being aware, by engaging, by recognizing that this is happening, and by meeting it as well as we can. So another question, of course, is how do we relate to this? How do we relate to what's going on in the blog sphere or the internet sphere, and how do we do that in the right way? It's also, I think, a great potential because just as the cyber media can be used for bad purposes, they can obviously be used for universally good purposes. So, I mean, by addressing that scene and engaging in the right format could also be an important part of the response. So I believe we need legislation. We need active governments who are willing to stand up and denounce the most extreme expressions, recognizing the importance of freedom of speech and the variety of opinions, and also being able to distinguish between people who, to take a very local case, I mean, it is quite legitimate to say that you don't want your parks to be full of garbage. You know, that's not racism. That's preference for clean parks. Because this is a debate that's going on in this country, and then to say that there are some particular features of a particular group that is systematically different from us, and hence they shouldn't be here, they shouldn't exist, they shouldn't be who they are. I mean, there's a big. We need to learn to talk about these things in a decent and insightful manner. There's a big room, of course, for human rights activists, a big room for media, big room for civil society, and I belong to those who believe that a government of a country can only get stronger if it has a strong civil society. We, as governments, get better because we are tested, we're held to account by active and open civil society organizations who will also, when we occasionally would err, will lead us in the right direction, and we need the watchdog purpose. The watchdog role of this. Then I want to say also, since we have very informed and leading researchers, it's incredibly important for policy makers and for the policy discourse that we have good insights to what's going on. We need to know what's happening, what is not happening, what's exaggerated, what is it that's happening that we're not seeing, and what are the trends and symptoms. Are we seeing a conglomeration of coincidental happenings that just take place at the same time with no relationship? Or are there clear relationships? It's important for open research. It's also open for a team for security services, of course, to try to follow, to find out what's going on. But first and foremost, we need an open and informed debate. And another final point is that I very much believe that we are now living, the benefit of living in 2013 rather than in 1929, is that first that we've had the experience, we had the extreme experience of the 1930s, we have the additional experience of the breakup of Yugoslavia, with the experiences of of Rwanda, of many places where seemingly well-knit societies suddenly collapsed and turned into systematic hatred and killing. So we have that experience, we have generations of democratic experience, which we didn't have then. We have strong institutions that did not exist then. We have European integration processes, we have the Council of Europe, we have the EU itself, we have the OSCE, we have strong UN instruments, we have many special rapporteurs from the UN here on the key issues that we're talking about. These institutions are now there, and it's possible to find collective answers in a way that wasn't there before. And that's a remarkable advantage to our generation, to our times, that we have institutionalized many of the norms, but not only have we institutionalized the norms, we also have built institutions that are there to overlook that the norms are actually applied. The problem is that this is not happening by itself. It requires political will. It requires that somebody actually wants to take the framework that exists and use it for a strong purpose. And this is very much what I want to, beyond just being here to agree about the problem, I really would encourage you to come up with policy advice and how we can get better at meeting what we are seeing, meeting what we are analyzing. I think that's crucially important. I will end by saying that on Thursday, I will be at the Council of Europe ministerial meeting, and the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, who happens to be Norwegian, by the way, and my former boss when he was foreign minister and I was deputy foreign minister 13 years ago, he has taken a very important initiative, I believe, which is to try to build some kind of scorecard system where we actually check whether the members of the Council of Europe are applying the rules that they signed up to when they joined. Nobody is obliged to join the Council of Europe. It's a free choice. But of course, once you do that, you sign up to a specific set of norms. And if these norms are violated, somebody should tell you. And of course, as you can imagine, the countries who fear to be more frequently on the bad side of the scorecard are less enthusiastic than other countries. But I still think this is going to be a very, very important debate, and the same debate is important also for other institutions. I would also like to say that the emerging close relationship between the European Commission of the EU and the Council of Europe is very, very interesting, and should really, and also those of you not working in either of those, should really take that seriously, because the EU, which is really the Senate of European integration, discovered that it doesn't really have the instruments that maybe it thought it had in order to respond to excesses. The Council of Europe has, so by linking closer together, there is a potential there. Well, I'm not going to speak any longer. I want to say this is something we deeply care about. It's very high on our agenda. It will remain high on our agenda. I'm really happy to see you all here, and I hope you have a productive meeting and that you come up with very concrete advice so we can create a somewhat better world together. Thank you for the attention.